Welcome to Lamore's Cards and Horrors. I'm Matthew, and this is another cEDH beginner guide video where I have experienced members of the community come on to teach you about one of their decks. If you enjoy this video, like, comment, subscribe, consider supporting me on Patreon so I can make more of these and make them better for you. And with that, I'll pass it over to this episode's guest.
Howdy folks, I'm Chief. I'm a member of the cEDH Discord staff. I write articles that are on playedh.com. I'm in the Eminence Gaming cEDHU where I teach Heliod Suncrown. I have a list on the cEDH decklist database called Lawful Evil. Heliod Suncrown is a cEDH stax deck in mono white, utilizing Rule of Laws, tax effects like Trinisphere and Thalia Guardian of Thraben, and other effects to slow down your opponents while you win, using either Walking Ballista or Triskelion as a win condition with your commander. When you're playing Heliod Suncrown, you want to begin your game by figuring out a way to get stax pieces out early. This could mean casting Deafening Silence, Archon of Emeria, Trinisphere, something that will slow down your opponents, while having a way for you to continue to play through it. Once you've established some stacks, you'll try to get your commander out, and you'll also try to make sure that you have a way to get card advantage or tutor for a win condition, either Walking Ballista or Triskelion. These cards create a one-card combo with your commander if you can use your commander to give them lifelink, allowing you to deal infinite damage to your opponents while replenishing the counters on them using his triggered ability. The reason why you want to make sure that you're getting stacks out early is that this combo takes a total of 9 mana in order to cast from start to finish. Usually you'll be playing it across multiple turns. It's not uncommon for you to play your commander first, have your commander out for a few turns, and then cast Walking Ballista. This is why you need to be able to make sure that your opponents can't win in the meantime. Since you're playing cEDH, most win conditions require your opponents to be able to cast multiple spells in a row in the same turn, which means that Rule of Law and Rule of Law effects such as Archon of Emeria, Deafening Silence, and Aethersworn Canonist can slow down your opponents and make it impossible for them to win. It kind of creates a catch-22 situation for your opponents where they might not always be able to remove that stacks piece and still win the game, so they can't afford to remove it and then pass their turn to someone else because that person would win instead. The main combo win condition of Heliod Suncrown is casting a Walking Ballista, giving it lifelink, and removing one counter at a time in order to ping your opponents down while using the life gain to replenish the counters on the Walking Ballista. This typically means that you need to have 2 +1/+1 counters on Walking Ballista when it comes into play, because you need to be able to remove one and have it still survive. This means that it costs 4 mana to cast Walking Ballista, 3 mana to cast Heliod Suncrown, and an additional 2 mana to activate Heliod's ability. If you have additional mana, you can use it to stack extra activations of Heliod's life gain ability, or pay extra mana into Walking Ballista in order to make it bigger, which can be relevant if you're planning on having to fight through removal spells, because you can activate the ability multiple times in response to the removal spell and usually still win on top of it. Triskelion is also available as a win condition, always costing 6 mana and always entering the battlefield with 3 counters. It's more expensive, but it can be more reliable than Walking Ballista under certain circumstances. Usually if there's something on the battlefield that stops Walking Ballista, such as a Phyrexian Provoker. For the most part, though, Walking Ballista will be a more reliable way to win the game, being more mana efficient under most circumstances. Being a mono white deck and a stacks deck, this is going to be on the slower end of cEDH. While it is possible for you to win early, this deck usually isn't ready to win the game for several turns. Your game plan is usually going to be to slow down decks that are looking to win before you, so that you can make sure that you're in the game long enough to win. On your first turn, you want to be able to do something that will allow you to remain relevant in the game by slowing the rest of the table down as best as possible, whether it's playing a Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Deafening Silence, or even a turn 1 Trinisphere. These things can allow you to make sure that your opponents don't have very much gameplay in the early turns, which lowers their efficiency a lot. And then hopefully have follow-ups on turn 2 of either layering additional stax pieces, casting your commander, playing out cards such as Esper Sentinel, or protection cards like Mother of Runes and Giver of Runes. These things can go a long way towards making sure that you stay in the game and continue to keep your opponents locked down, hopefully, where they can't take very many game actions. Because you're looking to make sure that nobody's taking more game actions than you, and you're not going to be taking as many game actions as the average cEDH deck. That means that you have to prioritize slowing your opponents down. One of the biggest mistakes you can make with Heliod is keeping an opener that doesn't actually have any direction to it. You might be tempted by Mishra's Workshop and a Trinisphere, but your hand might not actually have anything else to do in it after that. Or maybe there's a Jeweled Lotus in there, so you can cast your commander on turn 1. These are nice things to do, and if you have the ability to do them while also keeping a relevant hand, that's a good thing to do. But just keeping a hand because of these things is one of the biggest traps you can have in this particular deck. Another mistake that people make is assuming that your opponents will always understand the value of your stax pieces and keeping other opponents down. You have to be able to verbally defend stax in cEDH. If you're not charismatic and you don't have the ability to explain what's going on in the game and politic, this can result in your opponents making what ultimately amounts to gameplay errors on their part if they're inexperienced against stacks. So it's important to make sure that you understand the deck very well and that you're equipped to explain why you're playing the cards you're playing, what your goal with them is, what they're doing, and make sure that your opponents understand that you're slowing the game down and keeping everyone from winning and not just one person. Over time, if you're playing this deck, you'll find that you really start to understand what the capabilities of the deck are and what type of threats you're seeking to mitigate in cEDH. This can actually be really important when you're playing other decks as well, because the things you learn while playing this deck translate over to a lot of other decks, whether they're stacks or not, because you might run into stacks while you're playing your turbo deck or your mid-range deck, and this will give you a better understanding of what the deck is able to do, what it can do that hurts you, what it can do that you'll play through, as well as giving you an understanding of appreciating all of the threats that other decks have at all times, because you don't have the ability to stop a whole bunch of things on the stack while you're playing a deck like this. You have to almost be able to see the future while playing stacks and anticipate your opponent's game plan in a way that a lot of other decks don't necessarily have to be able to do to the same degree. When you're deciding whether to keep a hand or not while playing this deck, turn order is a huge factor, because going later in turn order against faster decks can greatly change the type of game plan you want to be able to have, while also going earlier can sometimes mean that you'll want to do something really nasty in turn 1 before your opponents can really do anything, which can sometimes take them out of the game almost completely. This means that being able to play stacks early is usually a good thing, as long as it's a relevant type of stacks for the table. Like, if you're playing against Najeela, Selvala, and Winota, you're probably not going to care as much about playing a Thalia, Guardian of Thraben on turn 1 or a Deafening Silence, because those decks are going to play creatures and they're just going to do creature stuff on your stacks. So maybe a Dranith Magistrate or Sphere of Resistance, something that slows your opponents down in a way that was actually relevant to what your opponents are playing, is usually more ideal. Not all games are going to want you to play the same stacks pieces, so it's really about knowing what you want to play based on who's in the game with you. First glance, this might seem enticing because you can cast a Jeweled Lotus, cast your commander, play Winding Canyons, and then play Grafdigger's Cage, and you've already cast 3 spells on turn 1. But there's no other colored mana in here. You've got multiple cards here that want multiple colored pips. There's really not a good plan here other than playing Grafdigger's Cage. So unless you know for a fact that all of your opponent's win conditions rely on the graveyard, there's no way that this is a relevant opening hand. And I probably wouldn't keep it even in that circumstance, because you have absolutely no other mana other than Jeweled Lotus and Winding Canyons here. The big issue with this hand is that it doesn't really have the ability to do anything super relevant on turn 1. And on turn 2, the most relevant thing you can do is play Ashes of the Abhorrent, which will stop your opponents from doing a lot of things out of the graveyard, but it won't really do a whole lot else. So I would probably send this hand away and hope for something different. This hand is dangerously close to being good. If you had one ramp source, I would probably consider keeping this opener. If you were in an early turn order where playing Thalia, Guardian of Thraben would be more relevant, because it has 3 mana sources. It has a graveyard hate card, and Weathered Runestone, which is kind of a graveyard and library hate card. Thalia will slow your opponents down, and it has a tutor that can find Walking Ballista or another relevant hate bear. So this is a pretty good hand. If you're playing against slower decks that aren't going to explode out of the gate, this is probably keepable, but if you need to be relevant on turn 1, this probably isn't a hand you would want to keep. I consider this deck to be very, very decent against decks that need to use their graveyard a lot because of the fact that it runs such a high density of graveyard hate, provided that you can get graveyard hate out early and preferably have multiple options to fall back on. This is something that this deck can usually accomplish. This deck is fairly good against Storm and Turbo decks, provided that you can play pieces early that will stop them and make their plays a lot less efficient and slow them down. A lot of times they'll have a difficult time answering creature spells, so the fact that you're running such a high density of creatures means that you can often have lots of relevant plays early while your opponents are still on the back foot trying to recover from the initial thing that started to slow them down and make their life miserable. Where this deck tends to not do as well is against decks that rely heavily on creatures, decks that don't care about stax pieces at all, because this deck is much, much more equipped to deal with graveyard decks, storm decks, turbo decks. But if a deck is comfortable playing a creature once per turn and eventually accruing like a winning game state, a deck like Najeela I would consider to be probably this deck's absolute worst matchup. Decks like Najeela and Kenrith that are comfortable to play through stacks, these are horrible matchups for this deck. Drannith Magistrate, mulliganing to remove the commander when it comes down, just making plays that can interrupt the common play patterns of those decks. Having a way to deal with those commanders that just get so much value once they're on the board and allow your opponent to just grind through things. If you're looking to play a deck that really rewards you for knowing your deck in and out, Heliod Suncrown is probably a deck that you should consider. Ultimately, Stax is harder to play than some other archetypes, but it winds up being a really rewarding archetype to play once you get good at it. And it can feel really fulfilling to win, even when you're considered the underdog, playing mono white, the worst color identity in Commander according to most players. I don't necessarily agree with that, by the way. I think it's fantastic.